Good morning. Thank you very much. It is great to be with you. It is great to be here in the great state of New Hampshire. Thank you for coming out this morning. I will say today, I signed my very first ad, which I have to admit, when I get home, Heidi and I, we got two little girls, Caroline's 6, Catherine's 4. They're going to find it very, very cool that I got to sign it. It should be on. Is it picking up or not?
No. No.
Yes, no?
No.
Okay. So, and I will confess, I did take 2 of the eggs for the girls. So if you're counting at the end and you're wondering sort of like the silverware's missing, well, you had a politician here and the guy cooked 2 eggs. So, you know, and every one of us who are parents, we know that God makes kids very, very different. Catherine, our baby girl, she's 4. Sweetest little thing you've ever seen. Catherine will crawl up in your lap. She'll just hug them. Caroline, on the other hand, is a rascal. It's how God made her. I remember about a year ago, Heidi and I had both girls up in D.C. for a weekend. It was one of those fall days. Beautiful fall day. We were driving down the George W. Parkway. Crisp, trees turning red and orange. You could smell it in the air. The girls are in the back. Catherine is in her car seat, sitting very quietly. Caroline's in her car seat, behind me in the truck, kicking the back of my seat like she normally does. And Heidi and I are listening to the girls talk, which is always fun to do. And Caroline turns to her little sister. She says, "Catherine, what do you want to do when you grow up?" And Catherine says, "I want to work in the U.S. Senate. I want to work with Daddy." And Caroline goes, "Oh, that's boring." She says, "We're going to be rock stars." And then she tosses in the zinger. She says, "Besides, Daddy will be dead by then." This was a real conversation. I was sitting there like, "Hello, I'm right here." I have to admit, I kind of wondered if maybe Caroline had been speaking with Republican leadership. If maybe she knew something I didn't know. Look, I appreciate y'all's being here today. I appreciate you coming up. What I want to talk to you about, there are a lot of enormous challenges here at home and across the globe, and I'm looking forward to getting into many of them, particularly on foreign policy and the Q&A. But what I want to address before we do that is something called opportunity conservatism. For a long time, I've described my domestic political views as opportunity conservatism. Now, what does that mean? That means that I believe we should look at every single domestic policy with a laser focus on opportunity. How does it impact the least off among us? How does it help those at the bottom climb the economic ladder? We should look with a Rawlsian lens. Now, many, many times, our friends in the media describe Republicans as the party of the rich. I'm convinced that's the single biggest lie in all of politics. Here's the truth of the matter. The rich do just fine with big government. Big business does great with big government. Big business inevitably has armies of lobbyists and lawyers and accountants. Big business gets in bed with government. The people that get hammered by big government are the little guys. It's the small businesses. It's the mom and pop. The top 1%, the millionaires and billionaires who the president loves to demigod. Today, the top 1% earn a higher share of our income than any year since 1928. Look at what's happened in our country in the last 6 years. The very top, those who walk the corridors of power in the Obama administration, have gotten fat and heavy. And working men and women are hurting. Millions of men and women across this country are hurting. We have the lowest labor force participation since 1978. Median wages are stagnating. They are the same today as they were in 1996. Think about that for a second. For 20 years, median wages have been utterly stagnant. We've got the lowest percentage of our working population working today since 78. In my view, every policy we think about, we talk about, needs to focus like a laser on climbing the economic ladder. So what's the difference between left and right? You know, it really is very simple. Those on the left, often with good and well-meaning instincts, look at someone on the economic ladder and they want to reach down and physically grab them and move them up. The problem is, it doesn't work. The only way anyone has ever climbed the ladder of economic success in this country is to pull himself or herself up one rung at a time. And in my view, domestic policy ought to focus like a laser on empowering, on helping people take ownership of their future. Now look, every one of us knows these principles, not just in the abstract, not just from some academic textbook. We know it in our own lives. My mom was born in Wilmington, Delaware. Irish-Italian family. Blue collar. Her mother was the second youngest of 17 kids. They were Irish Catholic. They didn't know what else to do on a Saturday night. When my mom was in high school, her dad was transferred down to Houston. And she became the first person in the family ever to go to college. She went to Rice University, graduated in 1956 with a degree in math. When she came out, she went to work at Shell as a computer programmer. Now listen, she was working at the intersection of two industries. Number one, computer science. Number two, oil and gas. Neither one was terribly welcoming to women. Both of them together was almost unheard of. And my mom used to tell me when I was growing up, she very deliberately didn't learn how to type. Because she said, look, I understood the world I was living in. It was the 1950s. She said, I would be walking down the hall and men would walk up to me and they'd say, sweetheart, would you type this for me? And my mom wanted to be able to smile very, very sweetly and say, you know, I would love to help you out. I don't know how to type. I guess you're going to have to use me as a computer programmer instead. And my mom is someone, she turned 80 this year. My mom is someone with a spine of steel. She's quiet and soft-spoken. And yet she's been a best friend to me my whole life, and she's got strength. But it embodies the journey so many of us have followed. Where she went from a working-class family to getting an education to going on and starting a small business and working towards the American dream. Just the same, my dad. My dad was born in Cuba. Grew up in Cuba in the 50s. Revolution was in the air. When he was 14, my father became involved in the Cuban Revolution. Joined the underground. He was on the student council in high school. It was interesting. The Cuban Revolution started the student councils. High school, college student councils. Any of the St. Anselm students, are you all involved in student council? It's not a student council. Well, I got to say, look, I was in student council in high school. Nobody ever confused us with revolutionaries. But in Cuba, the revolution started in the student councils in high schools and colleges. My dad spent several years in the revolution fighting, throwing Molotov cocktails, helping lead the underground. He was fighting alongside Castro. Now, he didn't know that Castro was a communist, and none of the kids fighting knew that. What they knew was that Batista was a cruel and oppressive dictator. When my dad was 17, they threw him in prison. They tortured him. They beat him halfway to death. My father fled Cuba in 1957. He had applied to 3 U.S. universities, and the first one that let him in was the University of Texas. So he arrived in Austin at the age of 18. He couldn't speak English. He had nothing but $100 sewn into his underwear. which I don't actually advise carrying money in your underwear. And his first job was washing dishes, making 50 cents an hour. Now, why did he get a job washing dishes? Well, because he couldn't speak English. And you didn't have to speak English to wash dishes. You had to be able to take a dish, put it under hot water, scrub it. He could do that, he didn't have to talk to anyone to do it. Now, my father followed the path of so many immigrants in this country, which is his first priority was learning English. Because he was enrolled at UT and the classes were in English. And if he didn't learn English very quickly, he'd flunk out. If he flunked out, he'd lose his student visa. If he lost his student visa, they'd send him back to Cuba. If they sent him back to Cuba, they'd kill him. That gives you a fairly acute incentive to learn English and learn it quickly. So he did a couple of things. One, my dad signed up for Spanish 101. And he reverse engineered everything the professor said. So when the professor said milk is leche, he'd go, ah, leche is milk. And he'd just sit and listen to everything and try to do it backwards. The other thing he'd do is he'd go to the movies. He worked 7 days a week and went to school full time, but he'd also try, particularly on Saturdays, he'd go to the movies and he'd see the same movie 3 times in a row. He'd just sit there and watch it over and over again. And you know, the human brain is marvelous. You start to associate words with actions, and within a month or two, he was thinking in English. And he began to learn English. Now, once he learned English, he got a second job. His first job, washing dishes, 50 cents an hour. His next job was as a cook. Now, cook was a better job, paid 80 cents an hour. He needed to speak some English, because if they order ham and eggs and you give them hash browns, it doesn't work. So, once he learned English, he could work as a cook. That was a great job. That led to his next job. As he got more advanced at UT, he was studying math. He became a teaching assistant, teaching math to undergrads. That was a much better job than being a dishwasher or a cook. That led to his next job, which was in 1962 as a programmer, computer programmer for IBM. And that in turn led, several years later, for him and my mom together to start a small business together, a seismic data processing company, a computer company in the oil and gas business. Today, my dad's a pastor back in Texas. Now, the point I want to make about opportunity is that journey everyone here understands. Every one of us, our families, look, my dad is my hero, but what is amazing about his story is how commonplace it is. Every one of us has a story just like that, whether us or our parents or our great-great-great-grandparents. What ties Americans together is we are the children of those who risked everything for freedom. And what's critical to understand about opportunity is those first couple of rungs of the economic ladder are the most critical. If my dad doesn't get that job washing dishes at 50 cents an hour, he doesn't get the job as a cook. If he doesn't have the job as a cook, he doesn't graduate from UT and get the teaching assistant job or the computer programming job, and every other step on the economic ladder depends on getting on that first rung and then being able to pull yourself up to the second rung. So now what does that mean? My time in the Senate, my number one priority from day one has been economic growth. I think economic growth should be a bipartisan objective. It should bring Republicans and Democrats together. Look, whatever people want to do with the money, if there's more growth, it lifts all ships. Then we can argue about what to do with the money. We go back and forth on that. But it's better for everyone to have the economy booming than stagnant. Since World War II, the American economy has grown on average 3.3% a year. There are only 2 4-year periods where growth averaged less than 1%. 1978 to 1982, coming out of the Jimmy Carter administration, and 2008 to 2012. That period, GDP growth averaged 0.9% a year. We cannot solve any of the problems we have with stagnant economic growth. Whatever you're worried about, if you're worried about the deficit, if you're worried about the debt, if you're worried about unemployment, if you're worried about strengthening our military, if you're worried about preserving our entitlements for the next generation, every one of those, with growth, we can solve those. Without them, they are unsolvable. There are a lot of people who are numbers people here this morning. If you look at the federal budget, there is only one first-order variable, and that is growth. Economic growth changes. If we get back to historic levels of growth, 3, 4, 5%, suddenly the entire federal budget picture turns around. If we stay in anemic, stagnant growth, there's no solution. We can't cut enough, we can't tax enough. Growth should be the singular focus. Now, how do you get growth? Well, historically, government has had 3 different levers to facilitate the private sector creating economic growth. The first is tax reform. If you look historically, every time we have pursued tax reform along with regulatory reform, the second, the effect has been enormous economic growth. That was true in the 1920s. It was true in the 1960s. It was true in the 1980s. Cause and effect. And by the way, every time we pursue out-of-control spending and taxes and regulations, the result has been stagnation. And yet, for whatever reason, people in Washington don't seem to understand that cause and effect. Let's take tax reform. Right now, today, Americans spend about $500 billion a year in tax compliance. Just dealing with lawyers and accountants and dealing with all of the paperwork from Washington. That is about the amount we spend on our entire military. And all of that is dead weight loss. None of that produces, as we say in Texas, a single truck or tortilla. We need fundamental tax reform. And by the way, tax reform ought to be bipartisan. If you think about it, Ronald Reagan passed dramatic tax reform with Tip O'Neill as Speaker of the House. It should be something that brings us together. Now, in my view, the best tax reform, what we should aspire to, is moving to a simple, flat tax, where every American can fill out his or her postcard, his or her taxes on a postcard. I think there is a populist moment right now to push for a flat tax and to shut down the IRS. That will only happen if it comes from the people. It will only happen if there is a grassroots movement behind it. Now, if we can't get there all the way, you know, some people, particularly our friends in the media, like to caricature conservatives as inflexible, unwilling to compromise on it. That'd be terrible if anyone said that about you. I can't imagine what that would be like. But like any caricature, it's false. My attitude of compromise from day one has been the same as Ronald Reagan's. What did Reagan say? What do you do if they offer you half a loaf? Answer. You take it. And then you come back for more. So let's take tax reform as an example. My object is a flat tax and abolishing the IRS. If we get leaders in Washington to come together with tax simplification that broadens the base, that lowers the rates, that simplifies the tax codes, that decreases the burdens Washington is putting on you, I will happily, readily be part of that, celebrate it as a victory, pass it into law, and then the next day go back and say, good, now we're halfway there, let's finish the journey. The problem in Washington is there are far too many people who are willing to compromise going backwards, who are willing to compromise in a way that is worse than the status quo. What I'm not interested in doing is just cutting a deal for the sake of, hey, we cut a deal. It's even worse. That doesn't make sense. We need to be fixing these problems, not just growing government. Reg reform, another critical lever. You know, the burdens every one of you has seen coming from Washington, whether it's the EPA and crushing regulations that are killing new jobs, whether it's Dodd-Frank, that are hammering not the big guys. It's actually a good illustration of opportunity conservatism. Dodd-Frank was sold to the American people as stopping too big to fail. How's that working out? The big banks today are bigger. They've all grown, and what has happened, Dodd-Frank in putting massive regulatory burdens on financial institutions, who gets hammered? The little guys. Smaller financial institutions, community banks are getting hammered like crazy. And here's the dirty little secret of Washington. That wasn't an unintended side effect. It was the intended purpose. Look, the giant banks, God love them. If they built through being successful and giving consumers a good product, that's great. But they've got the size to handle the overhead of hiring hundreds or thousands of new lawyers and accountants to do nothing but deal with the federal regulators. If you're a small community bank here in New Hampshire, the difference between Dodd-Frank and the additional cost it imposes on you can quite literally be the difference between surviving and going out of business. And we're seeing community banks and smaller financial institutions going out of business all over the country because of the crushing regulations. If we want growth, the focus has got to be on small business, because 2/3 of all new jobs come from small businesses. And the most oppressive regulatory problem we have right now, the biggest job killer in the country, is Obamacare. I believe in January of 2017, a new Republican is going to enter the White House. And in 2017 is going to sign legislation repealing every word of Obamacare. Now, there are a lot of folks in Washington who kind of like the flat tax think, well, that's too audacious. We've got to accept that we're just gradually headed that direction. There's nothing we can do about it. I fundamentally reject that premise. And by the way, so do the American people. You know, you may remember a year and a half ago, we had a big national fight about stopping Obama. Millions of people across the country rose up to say, stop this train wreck. There were a lot of graybeards in Washington who said, oh, this is a failed endeavor, this is a foolish endeavor, this is accomplishing nothing. They also said authoritatively, you saw lots of people go on television saying, as a result of this fight, Harry Reid will remain Majority Leader of the Senate and keep control of the Senate. Well, you know what? If that had happened, there'd be a lot of voices on TV going, I told you so. We told you so. That numbskull Cruz persisted in fighting against Obamacare, and look what happened. Well, the old rule, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. We just in 2014 won an epic, historic tidal wave election for Republicans. We had the largest majority in the House of Representatives since the 1920s. And Republicans won 9 seats in the Senate and retired Harry Reid as majority leader. And what was the #1 issue in this country? If you just measure what candidates campaigned on based on their campaign ads, the #1 issue in this country in 2014 was Obamacare. And it's interesting, it doesn't seem to have occurred to anyone in Washington that energizing and mobilizing millions of people across this country, elevating the debate about the disasters, all of the people who've lost their jobs, lost their health care, lost their doctors because of Obamacare, may have played some part in an historic tidal wave that changes control in Washington based on the exact issue that energized and mobilized those millions of people. And by the way, again, on opportunity conservatism. Look, Obamacare is not a big issue on Wall Street. Not a big issue in big corporate law firms. You get people being paid a whole lot of money. Obamacare doesn't impact you. Because if you're wealthy enough, Obamacare impacts around the margins. A, the salaries are high enough that it's not that big an impact on job creation. But B, if it impacts your access to health care, the wealthy can just pay more and get the health care they want. So when you go to the Upper East Side of Manhattan, Obamacare is not a big issue there. I'll tell you where it is a big issue, with people who are struggling. A few months ago, I was in North Platte, Nebraska. Huge rally, about 1,000 people out in the countryside of North Platte. I remember this young woman came up to me. She hugged me. She said, Ted, I'm a single mom. I've got 6 kids. My husband left me and he won't pay child support. She said, I'm right now working 5 different jobs. Not a one of them is 30 hours a week, because Obamacare kicks in at 30 hours a week. She said, I'm having a hard time make it enough to keep clothes on the backs of my kids. She started choking up. She said, I'll tell you the single hardest part. I go from job to job to job. I never get to see my kids. They don't get the mom they need and deserve. That's who's getting hurt. That's who our focus needs to be. If my dad were still washing dishes today, the odds are overwhelming he would have lost his job because of Obamacare. Because the people being laid off are not the titans of industries, it's the teenage immigrants washing dishes. If he hadn't lost his job, the odds are massive he would have had his hours forcibly reduced to 28, 29 hours a week. And you can't feed your kids on 28, 29 hours a week. We need to get back to an environment where small businesses are growing and prospering and creating opportunity. And by the way, for anyone who thinks, you know, it's interesting, when big government policies are in place and they produce stagnation, our friends in the media write stories like, well, these problems are just not solvable. This is the new normal. How many of y'all remember back in the 70s when we were told New York is ungovernable? Well, because liberals kept governing it, screwing it up. So obviously it was ungovernable. You hear the same thing with the economy. Well, we just need to accept there's going to be no growth, there's going to be no opportunity, this is the new normal. That's complete and utter nonsense. History disproves that. The last 4-year period was 78 to 82. What happened? Ronald Reagan came in, cut the top marginal rate from 70% to 28%, dramatically simplified the tax code, reduced the burden on small businesses and individuals, put in place reg reform, pulling back the armies of locusts of regulators crushing small businesses. And what happened? Not only did we see growth. Anyone know what GDP growth was in 1984? 7.2%. 7.2%. What that would mean if we were seeing the same thing is millions more people having jobs, climbing out of poverty, entering the middle class, getting on that bottom rung. And so our focus, I believe, on every issue over and over and over again should be how does it impact those struggling to achieve the American dream. That's what I call opportunity conservatism. It is a policy that recognizes what works. It's a policy that recognizes the American free enterprise system has been the greatest engine for prosperity and opportunity the world's ever seen. And that is my focus every day right now in the United States Senate. Thank you.